It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that knowing one version of Pride and Prejudice means that you know them all. In this mini-series on my channel, I discuss each adaptation of Pride and Prejudice as much as I can. I won't force myself to anchor all my arguments and reviews in theory, because I'm honestly pretty burnt out with YouTube. Instead, I try to give my honest review on the adaptations, discuss and defend my observations, and throw it out into the universe. That being said, if I so happen to bring up a theory when I talk about a particular observation, that's because it happened naturally during my writing and research process. To be honest, I don't know if I should even give an overview on Pride and Prejudice, because I assume that everyone knows, or at the very least, has heard of the Jane Austen classic in passing. The general gist of Pride and Prejudice is that it's the enemies to lovers story, with Fitzwilliam Darcy pining after the oblivious, less attractive middle child Elizabeth Bennet. At its core, the plot tackles many things, from its classism with the obvious financial divide between Darcy and Elizabeth, to sexism with the need to marry off the daughters because of said financial issues, to just general wrong first impressions, pride and prejudice and stereotyping, and hey, just being socially awkward at nearly everything you do. You know, I could just go on and on. In each of its adaptations, these core elements are pretty much retained in the narrative. Whatever version of Pride and Prejudice you're watching, these issues will be tackled and discussed because you can't really separate the issues from the narrative. Just how in-depth it goes into these theories vary on the producers and the director's priority and their storytelling direction. I would make comparisons now, but since this is a mini-series, I'm going to go one by one. Today we're starting with a rom-com of the 2000s, Bridget Jones' Diaries. I just want to start with the fact that Bridget Jones' Diaries is not the first or last movie to take a classic novel and turn it modern. It's not my favorite because that goes to Clueless. But despite that, I still think Bridget Jones is an incredibly charming film and franchise. Before it was a film, however, it was a 1996 novel by Helen Fielding. I have never read the book, but from the countless reviews that I saw online, it was, in general, well received during the time it was published. I don't also believe that the movie deviated much from the original story, so for now we're just gonna stick to the movie. If this goes well, I may just purchase the book and read through it quickly and maybe add, like, an addendum to this video. So the Bridget Jones' Diaries follows the antics of the 32-year-old Bridget Jones. She is, as most Elizabeth Bennet proxies are, single. She drinks a lot, smokes a lot, and is head over heels in love with her boss, Daniel Cleaver. During a Christmas party she attends with her parents, she runs into Mark Darcy, who she obviously doesn't get along with. After a very awkward altercation between the two, she overhears Darcy telling his mom, who was trying to set the two up, that Bridget Jones is a verbally incontinent spinster who smokes like a chimney, drinks like a fish, and dresses like her mother. And because of that offhand comment by a man that she doesn't particularly like, she decides to go and change her life. She quits smoking, she stops drinking, she works hard to lose all that extra weight she thinks she has, despite Darcy never mentioning her weight, and she looks to find her Mr. Right. She eventually ends up dating her very charismatic, very charming, very handsy boss played by Hugh Grant, and they have a hot and heavy but brief fling that was rudely interrupted by a young, more attractive, and skinnier girl from New York. Bridget Jones breaks off her relationship with Daniel Cleaver and decides to switch careers. So from publishing, she goes to television and becomes a memorable reporter. It's during a couple's party that she eventually crosses paths with Mr. Darcy again, who, in a very devastatingly humiliating confession, tells Bridget Jones that he likes her just the way she is. And suddenly, she starts to see Darcy in a very different light. The two eventually bond with one another, with Darcy going out of his way to sweep Bridget off her feet. During Bridget's 33rd birthday, he has dinner with her and her friends, which goes surprisingly well except for the food, until Daniel interrupts. The old feud between Mark and Daniel, which Bridget believes was caused by Mark stealing Daniel's fiancée away, leads to a fistfight which ends terribly when Bridget turns down both men. Weeks later, it was revealed to Bridget that it was Daniel who slept with Mark's wife and not the other way around. So she rushes off to a party and makes her final plea to Darcy, who at this point was about to take a new career path in New York City. Bridget's friends all rally together to cheer her up with a spontaneous trip to Paris. But just as they're about to leave, Darcy appears at her doorstep to profess his undying love. After another clumsy yet cute misunderstanding, the two make up by making out in a blizzard while Bridget Jones is in nothing but her knickers. And then Darcy flies to Greece because his maybe not really one-third daughter invites him to her wedding, he sings with Meryl Streep, and then comes out as gay. Now, if you were to ask me how much I like Bridget Jones' Diaries, I would rate it as a solid feel-good rom-com of the 2000s over 10. On its own, I think Bridget Jones shines because it's a very relatable movie. Bridget is the perfect rom-com lead, being clumsy and normal and insecure and sassy. This movie adapts the diary aspect of the novel well through voiceover, where Bridget just narrates the scenes as it's happening. It adds a lot of flavor and adds a lot more chaos, and it provides a little more insight into who Bridget Jones really is. Renee is a fantastic Elizabeth Bennet. Every word she says is oozing with sincerity. Whether she's cracking a joke about her body or sobbing about a cheating boyfriend, she knows how to convey her emotions well. Check out this scene here, where she basks in her misery after learning that Daniel Cleaver had cheated on her. Yes, she's hilarious, but at the same time, it's obvious that she really means it. It's not making fun of women who do this here, because I'm sure anyone who's been in the same situation would do the exact same thing as well. It's great seeing her like this, as a regular, fun, loving rom-com lead. Anyway, Renee took on the role headfirst and became Elizabeth Bennet, Bridget Jones. But I wouldn't say she's the one who shines the brightest in the star-studded cast. Hugh Grant is the highlight of the movie, being the most charismatic and charming modern-day Wickham I have ever seen. I have many friends who say that it becomes hard to root for Darcy when Daniel Cleaver is right there, with his negging and his charm and his Hugh Grant romantic lead energy. And yes, in some ways it becomes a bit of a shame when the douchebag villain outshines the leading man in some aspects. However, I think they casted Darcy well with Colin Firth, the human embodiment of adorable awkwardness and safe masculine energy. Bridget Jones did a lot of things right, but the best thing the movie did was perfectly cast the main trio. And the rest of the cast was brilliant as well. Perhaps not as adaptations, but as original characters that served their purpose well. Special shout out to Jim Broadbent, playing the cute and very homey father of Bridget Jones. Okay, for this part, I'm not just going to be comparing Bridget Jones to the Jane Austen novel. It's good, by the way. It's just not what I usually go to when I'm talking about Pride and Prejudice. I am, however, going to be comparing it to the variations of Pride and Prejudice that I like. After all, Pride and Prejudice is more than just Austen. It's grown into this kind of myth because it's been adapted over and over again, but is never really tired. I have watched and consumed more of these adaptations, and I've only read the actual novel once. Anyway, in comparison to other adaptations, I will say that Bridget Jones just removes the sisterly love and sisterly bonding and the friendship aspect and takes it and throws it out the window. In this adaptation, the romantic subplot of Charles Bingley and Jane Bennet don't even make it. The whole pretense of this big ball or party that Mrs. Bennet insists her daughters attend is replaced with a basic Christmas party. The awkward encounters Darcy and Elizabeth have don't occur in the middle of a courtship of Jane and Charles, and are instead just absolutely random. And if you think the erasure of Jane's arc and storyline is tragic, consider that of Lydia's, who is usually the reason for the big emotional turning point of Darcy and Elizabeth, and Lydia just doesn't exist. Instead, that emotional conflict that inspires something in Bridget to look past Darcy's demeanor is given to her mother and father, with this weird storyline of Bridget's mother leaving Jim Broadbent after years together, only for her to come crawling back to him when she realized the temper of the man she has an affair with is not worth it. Also, the way Darcy helps Bridget is by giving her a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to an interview instead of helping her with her sister, which I feel kind of undercuts Darcy's arc, because in Austen's version, Darcy helps her out with a dilemma involving Wickham and Lydia, and that showed Darcy's development and growth because he initially disliked Elizabeth Bennet because of her awkward and overbearing family and status in life. It was a real moment of growth for Darcy, and it just wasn't there in Bridget Jones. So him going out of his way to help her just didn't have that same dreamy effect it has in other adaptations. And Charlotte, a close friend to Elizabeth, never actually makes it in the movie and is instead replaced with 3 friends: Moaning Myrtle, Says Forkalot, and Tom. They don't really have much of a personality other than being comic relief. They don't really serve as Bridget Jones' moral compass in the same way Elizabeth Bennet and Charlotte does. And that's a shame because several reviews say that their presence in the Bridget Jones novels is more felt and more relevant to the narrative. The reason I emphasize this is because the female and family dynamics was always one of my favorite parts of Pride and Prejudice, and I think that's because I started with the Lizzie Bennet diaries, where the sisterly love was the main focus and her romantic relationship with Darcy was only number 2. So I might be going into this review with a little more bias than the average Pride and Prejudice fan. However, I think this will also be an issue for fans who go into Bridget Jones fully prepared for the nostalgia of the original Pride and Prejudice story. In short, if you're a purist, you won't like what they did here. That's not to say that Bridget Jones is a lost cause adaptation-wise. I think even if it took a lot of liberties with the specificities, it managed to do Darcy's arc justice, even without the presence of the Lydia Bennet scandal. Darcy is a difficult character to explain to people who aren't attracted to men. As I mentioned earlier, at first glance, he pales in comparison to Hugh Grant, who has way more screen time than any Wickham substitute I have ever seen. But that's also kind of the point. It even works that way in the books and other adaptations. Darcy's character is lame and broody and mean compared to Wickham, but is ultimately the better man because, number 1, he respects Bridget's boundaries and is probably the only non-relative who doesn't harass her in the whole movie, and number 2, doesn't feel overly entitled to Bridget Jones' affections, even when he admits his. It's that simple. I think Bridget Jones highlights Darcy being decent by making a lot of men indecent and creepy. And the sad but also brilliant thing is that it doesn't seem forced or unrealistic to have only one decent apple among a lot of bad apples. And that makes the last 5 minutes of the movie so incredibly satisfying, even for Hugh Grant fans like me. Because she gets with a genuinely good guy who understands personal boundaries and respects women. I will say though, and this is like one of the worst parts of Bridget Jones, even if I do like the movie, Darcy doesn't really undergo any change. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Bridget Jones doesn't call him out when he admits that he likes her just the way she is. In other adaptations and in the original novel, Elizabeth Bennet goes hard. She doesn't let the poor man breathe and rips into every single problematic thing he's ever done or said. Elizabeth Bennet is normally out for blood, and rightfully so after the comments Darcy makes about her and her family, whereas Bridget Jones just kind of lets him confess his feelings. The protagonist is Bridget, and the focus is on the emotional growth she had to undergo in order to see Darcy for the man he really was. And while Darcy, across all adaptations, is human and sweet and introspective and very helpful, yet awkward, in this version he doesn't have a great deal of deal-breaking flaws. Like, sure, he sounds elitist and is really bad with social cues, but at the end of the day, he doesn't really turn over a new leaf like the original Darcy, and instead just waits for Bridget to come to her senses. Even that whole cheating storyline ended up being the fault of Hugh Grant for telling a lie, and Elizabeth Bennet for believing it without knowing all the sides. There is nothing wrong with Mark Darcy, so you don't automatically see what's really great about him as a character in the long run. Just purely basing it on the first movie of Bridget Jones, because I'm not really looking to watch the other movies, while it is not the best adaptation of the original novel, it still manages to be a feel-good movie on its own. Like I said, it's witty and funny and just generally a cute piece of media that I actually would recommend to anyone who's missing the nostalgia of the 2000s. I do say that it loses a lot of gravitas because they removed Charlotte and the sisters, particularly Jane and Lydia. Plus, Darcy's arc doesn't really do it for me in the way it does in the original text, the Keira Knightley movie, and the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. But if you're looking for something casual to pass the time and get you in a good mood, then this adaptation is one for you. Say hi to Hugh Grant for me when you watch this one next. Hi guys, thank you so much for watching and reaching the end of my video. If you want to support my channel, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when any of my videos are going out. Hope you guys are having an awesome day and I'll see you all next time. Bye!